Welcome to Gwinnett County Public Library Fiber Art Fridays. Every other Friday, we will be bringing you a fiber art tutorial and project.
This month's topic is knitting. Today we're going to learn everything we need to know to knit our first project, a scarf. This will include how to read a pattern, how to make a gauge, and how to cast off and weave ends. For this project, you will need either a medium weight yarn with a US 9 needle or a jumbo weight yarn with a US 19 needle. This scarf pattern will have an option to use either. You will also need scissors, a tapestry needle, and a measuring tape, and you may want a needle gauge. Patterns. The first step when beginning a project is to read the pattern. We are creating this rib stitch scarf. Medium weight yarn, US 9 needles. 18 rows by 18 stitches in a 3-inch square. To create gauge, CO, cast on, 21 stitches, K1, P1, knit 1 stitch, purl 1 stitch, across the row. Repeat until 4 inches long. Pattern, CO, cast on, 41 stitches, K1, P1, knit 1 stitch, purl 1 stitch, across the row. Repeat until you've reached your desired length between 50 and 60 inches, and cast off in pattern. Included is also a pattern for jumbo yarn, which will work the same as the medium pattern, except it will use US 19 needles, and you'll cast on less stitches because it will be thicker. So to complete this pattern, there are a few things you need to know. You'll notice that the pattern has something called a gauge, and most patterns include this. A gauge, also called tension, is a guide that you create before you begin knitting a project to make sure it'll be the correct size according to that pattern. A gauge is measured by the number of stitches and rows per inch, usually in a 3 to 4 inch swatch, and it basically considers 3 things: the size of the yarn, the size of the needles, and the tension. This is how tight or loose you individually pull the yarn as you knit, and this will be different for everyone, which is why just following whatever the needle size and yarn is on the pattern and beginning doesn't always work. So if you knit with a lot of tension and pull really tight, your stitches create more small stitches than someone who knits with a loose tension and doesn't pull tight, creating less bigger stitches. This is why creating a gauge was invented. Because no two knitters are alike, one knitter may have to use a different needle size or even 1 or 2 sizes different from another to obtain the same gauge. If you don't achieve gauge, you should change your needle size up or down until you have reached gauge. The smaller the needles are, the shorter the gauge, and the bigger the needles are, the longer the gauge. You can see how this would affect your project if you were making a sweater that needed to be an exact size, and now the sweater doesn't fit. But the less critical size is to the type of project you're doing, the less critical it is for your gauge to be perfect. But it is still always a good idea to take time to create a gauge with the yarn and needles you plan on using to test out your tension and see how close you are to gauge. Gauges are also helpful to see how the stitch looks, and make sure you like the needles and yarn you're using before you get too far into a project. Knitting your gauge. We will follow the same stitch pattern to create our gauge as we will for our scarf. Many beginner knitting projects are basically different length and width squares and rectangles. So a 3 to 4 inch square is a gauge or swatch. Make that a little wider and a lot longer, it's a scarf. And make that rectangle even wider and longer, and now it's a blanket. We are creating a rib stitch, which is great and really popular with clothing because of its stretch and how it keeps its shape. A rib stitch uses an odd number of stitches and alternates between a knit stitch and a purl stitch throughout each row. If you're using a medium weight yarn and US 9 needles, begin gauge by casting on 21 stitches using a long tail cast on. If you're using jumbo yarn and size 19 needles, cast on 9 stitches. Remember, your tail needs to be long enough to cast on all your stitches, and a good rule of thumb is to multiply the width of the cast on by 3. So we know we're knitting a gauge that's between 3 and 4 inches. So multiply 4 by 3 to get 12, and leave a 12-inch tail at the end of your slip knot and cast on. Remember, we covered the long tail cast on in the last video, and you can find the link to that video in the description. Then, to complete the rib stitch, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, all the way down until you have completed the row. To make sure you keep the pattern throughout, you knit the knits and purl the purls. This means that when you start the next row, every time you see a knit, you knit it, and when you see a purl, you purl it. And this should alternate 1 to 1. You should also begin and end with the same type of stitch. So on the right side of your work, or the front that you began on, you should begin and end with a knit stitch. And on the wrong side of your work, or the back, you should begin and end with a purl stitch. Cast off. To finish your gauge and your scarf, you will need to cast off. For a rib stitch, you will need to cast off in pattern. This means you continue to knit 1, purl 1, or follow the pattern as you cast off. If you do all knit or all purl stitches, the top of the work will not be as elastic and it'll make your work have an odd shape, so make sure you follow the pattern. So to cast off, start by knitting the first 2 stitches over to the right needle. Knit 1, purl 1 in our case. Then pick up the first stitch, lift over the second stitch and over the needle point until it has been dropped on the bottom. There should now only be 1 stitch on the right needle. Now knit into the next stitch and repeat looping the second stitch up and off the needle. Continue down the row in pattern until you have only 1 stitch left. Now cut the end, leaving a few inches, and thread it through the final stitch and pull slightly. Your gauge is now complete. Now that we have knitted our gauge, we will need to measure it to make sure it's correct. So we will want to measure the rows and stitches within a 3-inch square. To read rows, lay out a measuring tape vertically and count the number of stitches up and down. For a rib stitch row, 1 stitch is every V shape. To read stitches, lay out a measuring tape horizontally and count the number of stitches from right to left. For a rib stitch, count every V and every recess bump that's next to the V across. If you achieved 18 rows by 18 stitches with medium yarn, or 7 rows and 7 stitches with jumbo yarn, then you have achieved gauge, and can move on to knitting the scarf pattern with the needles, yarn, and knitting tension you currently have. Yay! But if you didn't achieve gauge, you'll need to change your needles either a size up or a size down. If your gauge is too small and you have too many stitches, you need to make your needles larger and your stitches larger. If your gauge is too large and you don't have enough stitches, you'll need to make your needle size smaller, and that will make your stitches smaller. Knitting the scarf. Knitting the scarf will be exactly the same as knitting the gauge. One difference is when you cast on, you'll be casting on a lot more stitches, so you want to make sure your tail is long enough. The width of this scarf is going to be 6 inches. So 6 times 3 is 18. So you should leave an 18-inch tail at the end of your slip knot and then cast on. Another difference is that it will be a lot longer. So you'll probably reach the end of one ball of yarn and need to start another one. To start a new ball of yarn, first don't wait until you have completely run out of yarn because you will need to knit a few stitches and weave in the ends. You also want to try to add new yarn in the center of your work versus close to either end. When you've reached about the center, add a new ball of yarn by laying it over the work in the center between your 2 needles. Now grab both pieces of yarn, one from the new ball and one from the ball that's running out, and continue knitting in pattern for 5 to 6 stitches. Once this is done, let go of the old yarn and continue only knitting with the new ball. Leave a few inches hanging from both balls of yarn so you can weave the ends in and make sure it doesn't come undone. Weaving in your ends. When your scarf has reached your desired length, you will need to cast off in pattern. This is the same as with the gauge, and then weave in your ends. To weave in ends for a rib stitch, put the end into a tapestry needle. Then loop the needle around one side of the V's. It'll be easy to know which direction you should loop around the V because it'll really only let you do it in one direction. Loop around 5 or 6 and then pull the yarn through. Cross over to the other side, and then loop the other side of the V downward. Cut off the end, and voila, it's done. When you're weaving in your ends, make sure you're going up and down the V and not going across one of the indented sides of the rib stitch. Repeat this for all the loose ends on your work, and now your scarf is complete.
Thank you for joining us for Fiber Art Friday. Fiber Art Fridays are brought to you by Mackenzie, Janet, and Ashley from your local Peachtree Corners branch. Remember to bring your works in progress to Virtual Common Threads every Monday at 6:30 p.m. to share or get follow-up assistance. In the description below, you will find information about joining Virtual Common Threads and a link to our Fiber Arts site. Don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and visit GCPL's website calendar for additional programs. See you next time!